In the quiet of an old village, a story lay hidden, one that could unravel friendships and awaken secrets long buried. A single event, one that would turn allies into enemies and expose a truth that had been silently waiting. But when the distant sound of a bell rang, everything began to change. Hearts were racing, eyes were filled with fear. This isn't just a story about a bell. It's about a secret that no one could truly understand. If you think this is just another old tale, think again. You won't believe what you're about to hear. It was the kind of morning that did not arrive, but rather crept into being. A faint shiver across the sky, reluctant to open its eyes. The kind of morning when even the birds stayed hushed, and the air itself seemed to hesitate. At exactly 4:47 a.m., the great bell of St. Chad's Hollow let out a single deep toll that rippled through the mist-laden village like a tremor through ancient bones. Not a joyous call, nor a dire warning, but something suspended in a breathless, unsettling space between the two. A solitary note that wormed its way through shuttered windows, and nestled itself into the restless minds of light sleepers and anxious souls alike. Mrs. Weatherby, jolted from a dream she could not remember, sat bolt upright in her bed, heart hammering against her ribs, her room somehow colder than it had been a moment before, while across the cobbled street, Mr. Carruthers, halfway through tying his battered boots for the milk route, froze mid-motion, a half-formed prayer clinging to his lips. Even in the sturdy old vicarage, Alice Marchmont turned from her uneasy sleep to whisper into the thick darkness, "Lionel, it's not Sunday," her words quivering as if they too sensed the wrongness in the air. But the bell did not ring again, and by the time the feeble sun lifted its pale face above the hedgerows, the village stirred to life, not with the usual clatter of morning cheer, but with an undercurrent of murmuring dread, a quiet urgency that quickened hands and sharpened glances, spilling into whispered speculations at the greengrocer's, where theories like spores multiplied. A mechanical fault, a drunkard's prank, or perhaps more darkly, an omen of misfortune yet to unfold. But while tongues wagged and imaginations raced in the dim, ivy-choked drawing-room of the vicarage, Miss Marple set down her knitting with a thoughtful frown, listening not to the toll that had sounded, but to the silence that had followed. A silence so unnaturally complete that it pressed against the senses like a thick, invisible fog. A silence that spoke of things broken and beginnings not yet revealed. And later, as morning crept grudgingly into full light, that uneasy hush was shattered again, not by bells, but by the sharp, disbelieving cries of the sexton, who in climbing the tower to investigate a jammed window shutter, had stumbled instead upon death, the still body of Mr. John Willoughby, the village's quiet, precise clockmaker and guardian of the ancient bells, sprawled at the foot of the tower's narrow spiraling stairs, his limbs oddly composed, his face turned up not in terror, but in an eerie, resigned peace, and in his hand, clutched with a force that turned his knuckles white even in death, a small silver crucifix, an object no one could recall ever seeing him wear, an object far too fine for a man of such modest means. The coroner, when summoned, peered over wire spectacles and solemnly pronounced it a tragic fall, a misstep in the dim morning light, an accident wrapped in the shroud of plausible misfortune. Yet a creeping unease remained, stubborn and sticky, for the tower door had been found locked from within, and no footprints marred the dust of the upper landings, save Willoughby's own, as though he had walked willingly into the embrace of his fate, or been silently guided there by unseen hands. It was Miss Marple, with her unassuming manner and deceptively gentle smile, who noticed what the bustling constables missed: the unnatural positioning of the body, the absence of panic frozen in the features, the deliberate way death seemed to have arranged him like a careful hand folding away a favorite possession. And though she had come to St. Chad's Hollow, seeking nothing more than a few tranquil days of Easter repose with her goddaughter, quiet conversations by the fire, simple church services perfumed with lilies, the comforting predictability of village life, she now found herself standing once more at the threshold of a mystery, drawn into its tangled web, not by desire, but by an almost sacred duty to see what others chose not to see, to listen where others only heard. For in the whispers that slithered from the flower shop to the bakery, in the gossip that grew like ivy on crumbling walls, she heard the shape of secrets long buried, tales of old betrayals, whispered threats, and silent feuds too bitter to be forgotten. And while the villagers, in their nervous speculation, chalked up the death to tragic chance or misfortune, Miss Marple knew better, for death when it came naturally, seldom wore so composed a face, seldom left behind such carefully scattered clues, and deep within her, a chilling certainty began to bloom. The single toll of the bell had not been a mistake, nor an accident, but a summons, a herald of something far darker now set into motion, a game whose first piece had been moved under the cover of a reluctant dawn, and whose end, she feared, was still yet to come. In the days following Mr. Willoughby's sudden death, a quiet unease settled over St. Chad's Hollow, as delicate and persistent as the morning mist that curled along the hedgerows. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the subtle rhythms of human behavior, noticed it first not in whispered conversations or black armbands, but in the muted, almost mechanical way life resumed, how the church bell tolled with hollow precision, how the townsfolk's smiles seemed just a shade too practiced. When someone casually mentioned that the bell's mechanism had recently been inspected and deemed flawless, Miss Marple only nodded, her fingers never faltering over her knitting, though a seed of doubt nestled quietly in her mind. On the third morning after the funeral, rising earlier than her hosts, she sat alone in the vicarage's chilly morning room, tea untouched beside her, as her eyes drifted instinctively to the tall grandfather clock by the window, its bright chime striking 8, while her brother's old pocket watch insisted on 8:02, a mere 2 minutes fast, negligible to most, yet to her a needle against the fabric of routine. Casually she asked Alice if the clock had been tampered with, receiving a cheerful denial. Only Mr. Willoughby's routine maintenance the week prior, she said. But Miss Marple knew that in a village governed by timetables, train departures, church services, funeral rites, 2 minutes could veil an alibi, obscure a crime, or cover the faint echo of a desperate cry. Later, under a sky heavy with the scent of rain, she walked alone to the church, not to pray, but to stand within sight of the tower, counting each step in her mind, measuring how long it might take someone to slip between the vicarage and the belfry unseen. She imagined a path taken in the hush before dawn, a secret act masked by the solemnity of bells and the sanctity of silence, just enough time to hide something, or someone. St. Chad's Hollow was not a village that welcomed change, where seasons turned with ceremonial regularity, where scandal, when it surfaced, was confined to hushed tones and polite denials. To the untrained eye, it was a portrait of pastoral tranquility. But to Miss Marple, it was a place where truths festered beneath the polished veneer of respectability. Arriving for Easter with a new spool of cotton and her ever-curious mind, she had observed the rhythms of the vicarage, the subtle cracks in its genteel facade, the housemaid's oddly extended errands, the faintly discordant peal of the church bell just before Mr. Willoughby's death, things others overlooked but which to Miss Marple hinted at a deeper concealed dissonance. She reacquainted herself with the principal figures of the village. Mrs. Iris Fellows, imperious head of the Women's Guild, whose rigid morals were both shield and sword against the heartbreak of a long-forgotten jilting, and Mr. Amos Bradley, whose outward prosperity was betrayed by the nervous flick of his hands and unexplained financial entanglements with neighboring parishes. All presented themselves with the painstaking dignity that the countryside prized, but cities had long since discarded. And yet beneath the polished manners and careful smiles, Miss Marple sensed the tremor of hidden tensions, the quiet desperation of secrets struggling to remain buried. She knew as only she could that the village's greatest danger was not in the crimes committed, but in the terrible, determined silence that followed them. Naturally, the vicar himself, Lionel Marchwood, was a man of quiet grace, his gentle presence often misunderstood as the mark of a soul out of step with the darker currents of life. His absent-minded manner, like a leaf drifting along a slow-moving river, made him seem more suited to sermons of solace than to the intricate puzzles of human nature. Yet Miss Araminta Grey, an outsider by nature, and one who held her opinions as closely as her knitting needles, had always found his company oddly soothing. His memory, flawless when it came to scripture, was somewhat lacking when it came to people, as though the faces that passed through his life left only the faintest of impressions. But this, in Miss Grey's experience, was often a trait of those who looked to God for answers rather than man. The villagers, ever polite, greeted her with expressions that hovered somewhere between courtesy and veiled curiosity. Some were warm, others thinly veiled with a chill that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. Beneath their gentle smiles, Miss Grey could hear the faintest rustle of hidden truths, whispers of secrets long buried in the soil of the village. It was clear to her that St. Everard's Hollow, quiet as it seemed on the surface, had been stirred by more than just the ringing of the church bell that morning. Something ancient, something deeply rooted in the past had begun to shift. When Elias Brand arrived, the ripple of his return passed through the parish like a whisper on the wind, soft but laden with something unspoken. He was thinner than the boy who had left years ago, quieter too, his eyes now more distant, as though they held the weight of memories long suppressed. He had left for theological studies, but now, with his return, there was something haunting about his presence, a man caught between what he had been and what he had become. Miss Grey, keen as ever to read the subtle signs of a soul in conflict, noted that Elias attended the Sunday service, but sat at the back, his eyes fixed firmly on the hymnal as though the rest of the congregation had ceased to exist. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice seemed almost to apologize for its own sound, as though reluctant to disturb the silence that surrounded him. He left before the final hymn, a peculiar gesture that raised eyebrows. Yet, as Miss Grey observed, it wasn't the abrupt departure that piqued her interest, but his avoidance of Clarice Mayhew, a woman of sharp wit and sharper eyes, who sat in the pew once reserved for her late uncle. Clarice, with her precise gestures and city-bred demeanor, seemed immune to the strange forces that seemed to curl around the villagers' lives like smoke from a fire. Yet Miss Grey could see the subtle tension in her posture, a rigidity that could not be entirely explained by grief. Elias's path took him past the bell tower as the midday chimes rang out, and Miss Grey noticed the way he flinched, ever so slightly, as the sound filled the air. It was not the noise that unsettled him, but something deeper, some memory that seemed to come alive with each toll. She could not explain it yet, but she knew this much: Elias Brand was not merely a man who had returned home. He was a man who had brought with him a burden, one that could not be so easily laid to rest. Clarice Mayhew, in contrast to Elias, carried her grief with a dignity that bordered on detachment. Arriving from London on the 4th day after her uncle's death, she had not donned the traditional mourning attire of black silk and weeping veils. Instead, she wore dark structured coats, her posture as composed as ever. Miss Grey, ever the observer, saw beyond the cold exterior, and recognized the flicker of something unspoken beneath the surface. Grief, she knew, was not always expressed in loud tears or overt gestures. Often it preferred to remain quiet, folding itself into the corners of one's life, where it could be more easily hidden. Clarice was, after all, the only living relative of her late uncle, and as such, her presence was both expected and scrutinized. The villagers, who were quick to judge the unfamiliar, regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She was a woman of the city, smart, calculated, and indifferent to the slower pace of village life. Yet, when Miss Grey saw her alone in the churchyard, tending to the flowers, as if they were the only connection to her uncle she could still hold, something shifted. There was a tenderness in her movements that belied her stoic front, and for the first time, Miss Grey saw the faintest tremor in her hands, betraying the grief she had so carefully locked away. It was then that Mr. Percival Holt arrived, an antiques appraiser, with an air of polished sophistication that seemed to cloak him in a manner of mystery. He had come to the village to examine several church relics, an ancient chalice, a water-damaged hymnal, and a brass sundial that had long been left to weather in the overgrown garden behind the church. Holt was all charm and collected ease, his every word seemingly carefully measured, And yet, Miss Grey, with her sharp instincts, could not help but sense an undercurrent of something darker beneath his well-practiced smile. It was over tea, as they gathered in the vicarage drawing-room, that Holt spoke with a casualness that belied the weight of his words. "You know," he remarked, his tone light, "some relics are better left buried. The past, after all, is a dangerous thing to disturb." His smile never wavered, but Miss Grey, watching the subtle shift in the room, saw Clarice's hand tighten around her teacup, her eyes darting for the briefest of moments toward the window that framed the bell tower in its ancient silhouette. Holt's words, innocently enough spoken, seemed to linger in the air long after he had finished. Miss Grey, however, remained silent, her gaze never leaving Clarice, who had resumed her calm composure. But Miss Grey knew, she knew that Clarice Mayhew's unease had been triggered, not by the words themselves, but by the ghosts they unearthed. That evening, as the last of the light bled from the horizon, and the village settled into an unnatural stillness, Miss Grey retired to her room, her knitting abandoned as her mind began weaving its own intricate patterns. She did not yet know what relic Holt had referred to, nor what dark history Elias Brand had brought back with him. But she could feel it, the weight of something terrible yet to be revealed. The bell had tolled, but not for the dead. It had tolled for something far older, and Miss Grey was certain that the threads of the past, once pulled, would unravel a mystery that had long remained hidden in the shadows of St. Everard's Hollow. In villages like these, the relics people fear most are not buried beneath the soil, but entombed in silence, carefully hidden from the eyes that might pry too deep. It was a peculiar thing, death in a small village, a mystery that seemed both too ordinary and too strange all at once. When the coroner's report came through, brief and clinical, there was nothing out of the ordinary. A fractured skull, consistent with a fall, no signs of struggle, no poison, nothing that screamed foul play, just an unfortunate tragic accident, delivered in tones that were meant to soothe rather than stir. And yet, despite the report, the villagers' minds could not be so easily satisfied. They did not think in terms of legal documents or cold verdicts. They thought in memories, in the subtle shifts of expression, the unsaid things between the words, the silences that held more weight than any spoken truth. The whispers began as soon as the verdict was delivered, and though no one dared to openly contradict it, doubt quickly settled in like a slow-moving fog. For Mr. Willoughby, a man known for his cautious nature, had been anything but reckless. The church bell tower, towering above the village like a silent sentinel, had been his domain, a place he knew well, a place he would never have climbed before the crack of dawn, unless something or someone had pushed him. And then there was Mrs. Hamilton, the baker, who with a nervous glance over her shoulder, had murmured the word suicide in a hushed tone, before quickly retracting it. Perhaps he was unwell, she had said, though the seed of the idea had already been planted. But it wasn't suicide, at least not in the way most would think. It was something darker, something far more secretive, a rendezvous that had never been meant for public eyes, a lingering vengeance from years past finally being played out, or perhaps the final act of a guilty conscience that had taken too long to reckon with. Every theory, no matter how wild, had its adherents, and each spoke with a certainty that seemed to grow with the telling. Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, listened to it all, absorbing each murmur, each half-formed theory, with the precision of a master sculptor. She asked no questions, made no interruptions. Her method was to observe, to watch, to listen, and to let the truth come to her in its own time, like smoke rising from a slow-burning fire. She noted not just what was said, but who said it, who repeated what had not been made public, who avoided eye contact when Mr. Willoughby's name was spoken. In this village, as in any other, it was the silences that revealed more than the words ever could. And so, while the official verdict was accepted with the proper somberness, Miss Marple tucked it away like a misleading newspaper clipping, carefully folded and stored, for she knew it told only the version of the story someone had wanted told. In villages like these, there is a peculiar quality to gossip. It doesn't arrive with the brashness of a storm, but rather creeps in, silent and steady, like fog settling over the ground. It doesn't announce itself but makes its presence known slowly, slipping through keyholes, under doors, and into the corners of casual conversations. It was during one such quiet discussion in the vicarage parlor, with the fire crackling softly, and the scent of lavender and aging paper filling the air, that Miss Marple first heard the rumor. One of the Women's Guild members, her voice cautious and her gaze darting to the window, had spoken of seeing Mr. Willoughby the night before, standing near the church, talking to a woman. "A woman, I believe," she had said, her words laced with an accusation more than curiosity. Miss Marple, who had spent her entire life in villages just like this, knew exactly what those words meant. It wasn't a question, it was a statement veiled in uncertainty, a statement that held the weight of suspicion, even if no one was brave enough to voice it aloud. But the details were vague. No one could say for certain who had seen them, or how the scene had played out. Some said the woman had long hair, others said she had none at all, and some swore she had been cloaked in shadows, her face hidden from view. All they could agree on was that it had been a woman, and in a village where every face was known, and every gesture noticed. That fact alone held heavy implications. Miss Marple, for her part, asked nothing, made no further inquiries. She didn't need to. She could see it all clearly, the timing of it, the quiet of the hour, just before the shops closed, when the village was still, the air thick with the last light of twilight. The place too, by the church, just east of the bell tower, where the shadows seemed to cling longer, and the silence was more profound. It was secluded, perfect for a secret meeting, and in that silence, Miss Marple could hear the faintest echo of something old, something long buried. And yet the most telling detail of all was what came after. No one spoke the woman's name, not aloud, not even in whispers. No one suggested it might be Diana, though Miss Marple's instincts told her that the silence surrounding this unsaid name spoke volumes. It was in its own way an omission that could never be accidental. 2 days after the funeral, as the last of the village mourners filed out of the church, Miss Marple received a visit from Delia Willoughby. The woman was trembling slightly as she handed Miss Marple a folded letter, her hands shaking with the tension of something unspoken, something unsettled beneath the grief she had shown until then. The solicitor's letter had arrived, containing news that struck Delia like a bolt of lightning. The will, once thought straightforward, had been altered only weeks before Mr. Willoughby's death, and in that letter, Delia read the final shock. Her uncle's entire estate, the cottage, the savings, and even a collection of exquisite antique timepieces, had been left not to her, but to the church. Miss Marple, always composed, gave the appropriate murmur of surprise, though she knew the implications ran far deeper than what was on the page. Delia, for her part, was not angry, but confused. "He said," she began, her voice trembling, "well, not directly, but enough to make me think I was meant to carry on his work with the clocks." And as she spoke those words, Miss Marple's mind raced, 1,000 pieces falling into place. The clocks, the church, the silence, it all pointed towards something far more intricate than a simple death by misadventure. The questions now were not just about Mr. Willoughby's death, but about what he had left behind, and why. The morning after the tragic fall of Mr. Willoughby, the village seemed caught in a moment suspended between grief and suspicion, as though the earth itself had held its breath. While the official report from the coroner was swift and efficient, its words, "a fractured skull, consistent with a fall," failed to calm the rising unease that crept through the villagers' conversations. There were no signs of struggle, no poison, no immediate cause for alarm beyond the event itself, yet something about the way Mr. Willoughby had met his end did not sit right with them. The tidy verdict of death by misadventure was presented with all the necessary finality, but it didn't take long for the murmurs to begin. Low, hesitant, but persistent. The village, small as it was, had a way of unearthing truths that seemed hidden beneath the surface of polite conversations. And while most could not offer a clear contradiction to the coroner's conclusion, they knew in their hearts that something was missing from the official story. Willoughby was not the type of man to slip carelessly from a ladder. He was meticulous, cautious, almost obsessively so, especially when it came to heights and steps. The idea that he would climb to the bell tower before dawn, alone and without explanation, struck them as more than just an accident. It seemed a deliberate act, compelled by something, or someone, that had pushed him into that quiet, secluded space of the churchyard. It was Mrs. Hamilton, the baker, who first whispered the word suicide aloud, though she quickly backpedaled, offering other less definitive explanations, like the possibility of an illness. Still, the seed of suspicion had been planted, and it began to sprout in the minds of others. Some spoke of darker possibilities, an affair, a rendezvous, perhaps a long-buried act of vengeance. Others, more cautious, speculated about guilt, an old wound finally surfacing in the dead of night. Each theory, though different, shared a common thread. None of them fit the tidy explanation the coroner had given. But Miss Marple, ever the observer, listened quietly to it all, letting the whispers wash over her, knowing that in every word spoken and every silence held, there was a deeper story unfolding. She did not interfere in the flow of the conversation, but absorbed it, allowing the truth to reveal itself in fragments. The key was not in what was said, but in who said it, how they said it, and the things they chose not to speak of. It was in the small details, the sudden hesitation, the way someone's gaze dropped when Mr. Willoughby's name was mentioned, or the way some individuals repeated information that had not yet been made public. There were layers to this tragedy that no one had yet uncovered, but Miss Marple knew better than to ask direct questions. The answers were already there, hidden between the lines, in the flickers of guilt, the glances that darted away when the subject grew too close. And so, she quietly folded these observations into her mind, knowing that in time, they would begin to weave themselves into a coherent pattern. It was the gossip about the woman, always referred to with an uncertainty that both intrigued and unsettled, that Miss Marple latched onto next. A vague mention, perhaps unintentionally dropped by one of the Women's Guild members, spoke of a figure seen near the church the evening before Mr. Willoughby's fall. A woman, though no one could say for certain who she was, and yet, the way it was said, the manner in which it was phrased, carried with it an accusation. Miss Marple recognized the nuance. A woman, I believe, had been spoken not with curiosity but with suspicion, and the timing of the sighting, a twilight hour, just before the shops closed, near the bell tower, was too deliberate to ignore. There was something about the suggestion that weighed heavily in the air, something unspoken that the village, with its sharp instincts, had chosen to leave hovering in the shadows. No one wanted to say it aloud, but the implication was clear. The figure seen by the church could have been Delia Willoughby, Mr. Willoughby's niece, and yet, even in the light of these insinuations, no one dared to speak her name directly. Miss Marple, ever the patient investigator, allowed this silence to settle over the village like fog. It was in this silence that her suspicions began to crystallize, not just about the woman by the church, but about the events surrounding Mr. Willoughby's death, the strange timing, and the choices that seemed to have been made in secret. Then, just 2 days after the funeral, Delia Willoughby came to the vicarage, her hands shaking as she clutched a letter, a legal document that had altered the course of everything. The will, once expected to leave her the small estate, the cottage, and a modest fortune, had been changed in the final months of her uncle's life, leaving everything instead to the church. Delia, though grief-stricken, was not angry, but confused. Her uncle had never spoken of such a change, never hinted at it. She had expected to inherit the responsibility of caring for his collection of antique clocks, but instead, she was left with nothing. The implications of this were too great to ignore. Miss Marple, ever the calm presence, did not question Delia, but her mind was already racing, piecing together the events. Why had Mr. Willoughby made such a decision, one so deliberately kept from his niece? And what had it meant, this strange alteration of his will, made in the silence of his final days? As Delia spoke of the letter, Miss Marple's mind flicked back to a small detail that had been gnawing at her since the day of the funeral: the burned crucifix. The church had claimed it was not Mr. Willoughby's, but no one had come forward to claim it, and its presence seemed more than just an oversight. It was in the locked case, hidden away, and forgotten. Miss Marple, with Alice's help, had taken a closer look at it. The faint discoloration on the lower edge of the cross, where the metal had curled in intricate filigree, caught her eye. A small burn mark, precise and faint, as though it had been exposed to brief but intense heat, perhaps from a fire, or perhaps from something else entirely. The connection, though tenuous at first, began to form in her mind. The burning of old parish records, the secrecy surrounding Mr. Willoughby's will, and the mysterious burn mark on the crucifix, were no longer isolated events. They were linked, threads weaving together in a tapestry of hidden motives, fears, and long-buried secrets. Something had happened in the past, something the village had tried to forget, and Miss Marple was beginning to see how it all fit. The truth was out there, like smoke rising from a slow-burning fire, and Miss Marple was determined to follow it wherever it led. The formal reading of Mr. Willoughby's will, which had once been an inevitability in the minds of many, arrived with the same calm finality that seemed to hang over the village since the tragedy. Delia, his only surviving relative, had already imagined herself inheriting his modest estate. The ivy-clad cottage, the eclectic collection of horological curiosities, and perhaps a sum hidden away in savings, modest but sufficient. Yet when Mr. Finch, a man whose thin methodical voice suited his role as executor, read the document, it held none of the familiar assurances that Delia had anticipated. The entire estate, both real and personal, was bequeathed not to her, but to St. Chad's Hollow Parish, to be managed by the Church Council for the preservation of timekeeping within the parish. The words, though spoken with precision, hung in the air longer than expected, their unexpected nature sinking deeper than any sorrow. It was in its way a poetic legacy, an eternal tribute to time, but it was also an utter betrayal of what Delia had believed was her right. She made no sound, not a sob, or a protest, but sat pale, unmoving, as though the will itself had stolen the breath from her lungs. Reverend Marchman, uncomfortable in the silence, cleared his throat, and murmured a few vague words about the church's responsibility, while Mr. Finch, ever the professional, offered only the kind of meaningless platitudes expected in such circumstances. "Your uncle must have had reasons," he said, as though that could explain the sudden alteration of Delia's world. But it was Miss Marple, who had attended at Alice's request, who observed the scene with unshakable composure. What struck her wasn't Delia's silence. It was the quality of that silence. It wasn't the stunned silence of someone faced with the unexpected, but the silence of someone who had long ago been resigned to disappointment. A silence that suggested the wound went deeper than mere inheritance disputes. Delia's grief wasn't born of monetary loss. It was the grief of someone who had always been unrecognized, someone who had hoped for love, for connection, and had been denied both. That kind of sorrow was ancient, far older than any will could explain. Meanwhile, the village, ever eager to fill the void of official facts with unofficial theories, immediately drew connections between the rewritten will and Mr. Willoughby's death. Whispers began to swirl. "Poor girl," some said, referring to Delia. "Strange man," others muttered, pointing their fingers at Mr. Willoughby. But a more insidious whisper began to take shape, one that linked motive and opportunity, one that placed Delia at the center of the tragedy no niece would ever wish to be in. Yet Miss Marple, ever the observer, took in the depth of Delia's distress without jumping to conclusions. There were no dramatic outbursts, no accusations, only a deep, almost quiet, bewilderment. Her grief was not about the lost inheritance. It was something far more complex. Delia's simple, almost sorrowful remark about her uncle's change. He changed, held a weight that not many in the room seemed to notice. The word "unsettled" lingered in the air, and Miss Marple turned it over in her mind. She knew well that the most revealing truths often came from the words left unsaid, or from the moments when people weren't fully aware they were being observed. While others contemplated the legalities and the unfairness of the will, Miss Marple, in her quiet way, began to ponder something else entirely. Not who stood to gain, but why the will had been rewritten at all. Why had Mr. Willoughby, in his final days, chosen to leave behind a legacy of clocks rather than a living relative. It wasn't just an inheritance dispute. It was a question about the very nature of his life, his relationships, and the shadow that had lingered over him. It was this question that led Miss Marple to the bell tower, a place that always carried an unsettling weight in the village. The tower was sacred and isolated, its creaking wooden steps weathered by time, standing as a silent sentinel to the village's most hidden secrets. Miss Marple, with Alice's permission, ascended the tower under the pretext of stretching her legs. It wasn't mere curiosity that drew her upward. It was a persistent question that gnawed at her. The locked door, which had been sealed from the inside, suggested no external interference. But Miss Marple, with her sharp eye, noticed something others had missed. The trap door to the lower stairs was scratched, narrow, jagged grooves, the kind that suggested an attempt to force the mechanism from below. Not a mark left by age, but by a deliberate hand trying to open the door from within. The evidence was subtle but telling. There had been no simple fall in the tower. No, something had been tampered with. Something had been hidden. As she turned over these thoughts, Miss Marple knew she was no longer dealing with just a simple accident or an inheritance gone awry. There was something darker at play here, a carefully constructed web of secrets, one that had begun to unravel the moment Mr. Willoughby's will was read. And Miss Marple, ever patient, knew that the full story would not be told in one dramatic revelation, but in the small quiet pieces, the kind that slipped through the cracks when no one was watching. The truth, she knew, was hidden just out of sight, waiting for her to bring it to light. It was a mystery shrouded in the quiet pulse of the village, where the smallest movements held secrets, and the oldest walls whispered untold stories. The funeral of Harold Fairway, a man with a history that hadn't yet been fully unraveled, left more unanswered questions than any resolution. His will, an unexpected testament, had shifted the air in the room, much like the dust that clung to forgotten relics in a forgotten attic. He had left no fortune, no grand legacy of wealth, but something far more unsettling. His entire estate, with its faded charms of an ivy-clad cottage, and a collection of aged timepieces, was bequeathed to a cause most peculiar, a local parish dedicated not to charity, but to preserving the passage of time itself, administered by a council whose faces had never before seen the inside of his home. It was a legacy that none could have anticipated, one that raised more eyebrows than it settled hearts. His niece Clara, who had expected at least a token inheritance, sat in stunned silence. Her grief wasn't one of bitterness, but of bewilderment. It was as if the death of her uncle had closed a door in her life that she hadn't even known was open, and she was left to mourn not a fortune lost, but a recognition withheld, something far more human and far more painful. The village, ever eager to weave narratives, found itself teeming with gossip. Some whispered of long-standing tensions, others of motives buried deep within the family's history. But amidst the growing web of theories, it was Miss Wilford, whose quiet wisdom often made her a sharp observer, who paid attention to the silence. It was a silence not of shock, but of resignation, as if Clara had been expecting this twist long before it had been revealed. Meanwhile, the village's speculation deepened, but Miss Wilford's mind turned toward a different, more pressing question: the true nature of the death that had preceded the reading of the will. The tragedy had not merely been one of a will rewritten, but of a life, or perhaps lives, hiding behind the curtains of a church tower, where echoes of ancient bells might still carry the secrets of the past. It was on the 6th day after Harold's funeral that the next strange occurrence emerged: the death of a local historian, Ruth Hardwick, found lifeless in her garden, a cup of tea still warm beside her, but the scent of death far more bitter than any brew she had known. The doctor had confirmed what all suspected: cyanide. It was too clear, too sudden, but Miss Wilford, her mind ever vigilant, had seen the smallest detail that no one else noticed: the piece of fabric caught on the rose trellis, a scrap from the very choir robe Ruth had been working on. The thought was chilling. Had Ruth stumbled upon something hidden in the church's archives, something so dangerous that it had driven her to an untimely end? As the whispers grew louder, so too did Miss Wilford's suspicion that fear, not guilt, had driven Ruth to her demise. For fear, as she well knew, often pointed not to the one who committed the first crime, but to the one who feared the truth most of all. And as her mind wandered through the twisted corridors of the village's past, Miss Wilford found herself drawn to the figure of Edwin Crawford, a man whose return to the village seemed too well timed to be mere coincidence, a man who walked with his eyes cast down, never once allowing himself to meet the gaze of the bell tower. It was not the behavior of a man revisiting a lost childhood, but of someone walking through a field of old memories he wished never to awaken. Miss Wilford knew something was hidden there, in the shadow of the tower, where the bells tolled not for joy, but for a truth long buried. The more she observed Edwin, the clearer it became. His return had not been a homecoming, but a quiet reckoning with a past he could not escape. Late one evening, after the day's mundane discussions had finished, Miss Wilford turned to her close friend Alice, her voice low. "Do you remember, Alice, when we were children, and we were told that if we'd done no wrong, there would be nothing to fear?" Alice looked up, a distant smile playing on her lips. "Yes, but I've never seen it comfort anyone, especially not those whose fears run deeper than conscience." Miss Wilford's gaze lingered on the fire, her thoughts moving like a river through dark currents. "That's the truth, isn't it? Because the truly guilty are not afraid of justice. They fear being remembered, being seen not by strangers, but by places that hold their secrets. The bells, the walls, the silence. It's not justice they flee, but the recognition that someone, somewhere, knows exactly what they did." Alice said nothing, her hand still on the teapot, the weight of Miss Wilford's words sinking into the quiet of the room. For in that silence, as the flames danced softly in the hearth, Miss Wilford knew, sometimes the truth doesn't shout, but whispers, from places long forgotten. In the stillness of St. Chad's Hollow, where the wind whispered through the trees with a voice that seemed almost deliberate, there was a silence that held the village in its grip, a silence born not of peace, but of sorrow and secrets, carefully preserved over the years. Miss Marple had learned, through decades of quiet observation, that villages, with all their outward cheer, often carried deep, unresolved griefs, and none were more steeped in mystery than the untold story of Emily Bowden. A decade had passed since her death, described then as tragic, a fever that struck suddenly, or so they said, but the official story had unraveled like thread from a worn tapestry, when Miss Marple pressed for more details. No funeral had been held, no grave marked her passing, only a brief, unremarkable note in the church ledger. Emily B., March 17th, moved to care of relations, but no one could name these supposed relations, nor could anyone say where they had come from, or where they had taken Emily. It was as if she had simply vanished, slipping from the world without leaving a trace, her life swallowed up by the hollow. The bell, which had tolled the day of her death, seemed to echo with a knowledge that no one dared speak aloud. For 10 years the villagers had kept their heads down, as if the memory of Emily, her quiet beauty, her voice that had once soared in the church choir, was too painful to confront. It was a collective unease, a discomfort that ran deeper than mere pity. It was the kind of silence that clung to them, heavy with regret, as though they had all somehow been complicit in the tragedy, a tragedy too inconvenient to be acknowledged. It was during a visit to the vestry, after some polite, almost mechanical exchanges about the choir and the youth groups of the past, that Reverend Marchmont's facade began to crack. He had been too dutiful, too constrained by his role to admit the truth, but when Miss Marple asked about Emily, the words came out in halting fragments. Yes, he remembered her, a quiet, devout girl, a lovely voice in the alto section, but her death had been more than sudden. It had been cloaked in secrecy. Emily had been with child, though no father had ever been named. There had been no accusations, no confessions, only a letter, left at the church, and then she was gone. The letter had never been read aloud. It was kept by Willoughby, hidden away in case it was ever needed. The words were like a thread, slowly unraveling in Miss Marple's mind, each fragment of the story pushing her toward the unspoken truth. The existence of that letter became an obsession, an itch she couldn't scratch. It wasn't just a letter. It was a confession, an explanation, and more than likely, a burden someone wished to bury. The next day, Miss Marple and Alice ventured into the church archives, the musty smell of old paper filling the air as they sifted through ledgers, receipts and records, an organized chaos that seemed designed to hide more than it revealed. It was there, amidst the disarray, that she found the gap, a space in the March 10th correspondence, where someone had been intentionally removed, a hole in time, waiting to be filled. And it was then that Miss Marple understood. Emily's story was not a simple tragedy, nor had it been forgotten. It was being kept alive, deliberately veiled in shadows, and the truth it contained was one that someone was willing to do anything to keep buried. The letter was no longer just a letter. It was the key to everything, and Miss Marple was closing in on the answer. Every clue, every shift in the silence, pointed to one inescapable fact. The village had its secrets, and Emily Bowden had been its keeper. In the weeks following Emily's sudden disappearance, there was an unsettling void, an absence that wasn't filled by the usual rumors or whispered apologies. It was as though something had been deliberately erased from the collective memory, the kind of silence that seems to grow heavier over time. Miss Marple, with her long familiarity with village secrets, knew this silence well, and it was one that had long clung to St. Chad's Hollow, a silence that bore the name of Emily Bowden, though few spoke it aloud. Her death, marked a decade ago, had been labeled a tragedy, a young life cut short, but the official narrative was suspiciously clean, offering little more than a vague fever that took her, or perhaps a fainting spell by the river's edge. Yet when Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, questioned those who had known her, Alice, the elderly guild members, and those who still remembered the girl, they faltered, their recollections growing murkier with every passing question. No one could quite recall the funeral, nor the family she had been sent to after her death. No one knew where she had been buried. Even the parish records offered scant details. Emily B., March 17th, removed to care of relations. Those relations, a mystery, even to the villagers. As Miss Marple pondered the tolling of the bell a decade ago, she couldn't shake the feeling that Emily's story, like the bell itself, wasn't fully explained, wasn't as distant from the present as everyone seemed to think. What lingered in the whispers surrounding Emily was a sense of soft regret, no disdain, no pity, but an unease that had aged into something almost tangible, as though the village had loved her in its own way, but her presence had become inconvenient, and yet no one had spoken of her disappearance more than in vague terms. There had been no confessions, no accusations, just a hushed reverence. Miss Marple's curiosity turned into quiet resolve, as she began to question not what had happened to Emily, but why no one seemed to have ever asked the right questions. It was during one of her tea sessions with the Reverend that she learned, not from direct inquiry, but from simple conversation, that Emily had been with child. No father had been named, no confession had been made. The girl had left a letter, one that was never read aloud, kept hidden in case it might ever be needed. Miss Marple sensed that this letter was the key. Why had it been hidden for so long? The next day, with Alice by her side, Miss Marple sifted through the church archives, a collection of old records and papers, but the letter was nowhere to be found. Instead, one file stood out, its contents clearly missing, a hollow indentation, where something once lay. The letter had been taken, and it wasn't a mere accident. Someone had known about it, and for reasons only they could understand, had waited a decade to remove it. Miss Marple's mind spun with questions, but she knew that answers would not come from the archives. They would come from people who had lived through the silence and buried their guilt beneath layers of denial. Her next visit was to Lucien Gray, a man whose grief had been cloaked in silence for years. He had known Emily, though their connection had been quiet, innocent, shared moments after services, conversations by the river. Lucien, who had once admired her devotion, had known nothing of the pregnancy or the letter, but he too had sensed something was wrong. something that had never sat right with him. Miss Marple, knowing that hidden truths often find their way to strange places, turned her attention to the old church portrait of St. Chad, a painting that had always felt oddly placed, as though it concealed more than it displayed. With Alice's distracted approval, Miss Marple removed the frame, revealing behind it, wedged between the wood and the canvas, an envelope, unmarked, unsealed. Inside was the letter, Emily's handwriting unmistakable. She spoke of fear, of a summons to meet someone where the bell rang first. The letter was not filled with names but with vague implications. A quiet promise kept, the kind made by someone too trusting, too innocent. As Miss Marple read the final line, her heart sank. "I heard the bell," it read. "He told me to meet him in the tower." The bell had not tolled by chance, as everyone had believed. It had rung on purpose, a summons, a command. Emily had answered it, unknowingly stepping into a trap. The past, it seemed, had never really left. It had simply waited, hidden in the shadows, until the right moment to reveal itself. And that moment, Miss Marple knew, had come. The puzzle pieces, once scattered and disjointed, were now falling into place. The bell, the letter, the hidden truth, it was all a story long buried, waiting to be uncovered once again. A week before Emily vanished, something peculiar had happened in the church records room. A document, once nestled within its folder, had vanished. Yet, its indentation remained, a subtle whisper of what had been. Alice, ever observant, pointed out the gap. But Miss Marple remained unfazed. "Things do not simply disappear," she remarked, with quiet certainty, her mind already working. Someone had taken the letter, had sought it out deliberately, not by chance. The question was, who, and why had it taken them so long to act? Miss Marple's sharp eyes traced the contours of the village's silence, the buried secrets that had lingered for years like forgotten ash. It was not the letter but the intentions behind its removal that spoke volumes. Someone had known of its existence, had known its weight, and had waited, biding their time for the right moment to strike. To the villagers, the matter had been sealed in silence, each one retreating into their own private griefs. But Miss Marple knew better. She believed that when guilt is buried deep, it doesn't vanish, it festers, only to resurface in the most unexpected places. And so she turned to Lucien Gray. His silence about Emily's disappearance was not born of ignorance, but of personal loss, a grief so deep it had swallowed him whole. As he sat on a weathered stone by the river, his usual poise was a fragile shell, cracked by years of unspoken regret. He admitted to knowing Emily, not intimately, but with a quiet admiration for her intelligence and grace. They had shared words after church services, walked along the riverbank, exchanged letters. But after her disappearance, Lucien had remained silent, too silent, asking no questions even as the whispers grew. Something felt wrong, but no one had encouraged him to pry. When Miss Marple pressed him gently about the church's relics, his answers drifted away from chalices to memories of Emily. Memories she had trusted him with, though she had never confided why. And then it all began to unravel. She had been summoned, called to the bell tower, by someone she trusted. But Miss Marple's sharp gaze found no answers in the empty church archives. It was then that the dust-covered portrait of St. Chad caught her attention, its frame crooked, as if hiding something more than just paint and canvas. She lifted it carefully, revealing behind it a hidden envelope. Inside, a letter, Emily's handwriting, spoke of fear, of an appointment, of a bell that had once called her, and which now seemed to echo through the years. The bell, Miss Marple realized, had not merely tolled that fateful night. It had been rung with purpose, a deliberate signal. Emily had answered it, and in doing so, had stepped into the shadows from which no one would return. Miss Marple sat long with the implications, considering not just the letter, but the people bound by its unspoken truths. And then there was the confrontation. It did not come with fanfare, but with the quiet weight of an inevitable truth. Delia Willoughby, dressed in her calm reserve, found Timothy Crane, by the lich gate, thumbing through a book, a facade of calm masking the tremor in his hands. Miss Marple, watching from afar, knew the truth before it was spoken. The conversation began simply, but it was Delia's question that cut through the air, her voice steady yet carrying the weight of years. "Did you know what happened to Emily Bowden?" Timothy's answer was frail, brittle. He denied any wrongdoing, but his hands betrayed him, trembling slightly. Guilt was a quiet thing, not loud or dramatic, but it seeped into the smallest gestures, the nervous twitch of a hand, the avoidance of eye contact. He had left St. Chad's Hollow in a hurry years ago, not even bothering to say goodbye to Emily. As Delia walked away, Miss Marple understood the depth of his guilt. It was not in the words he had spoken, but in the silence he had allowed to stretch on for so long. Silence had been his companion, and in its presence, he had buried the truth. The Reverend Marchmont, once a figure of comfort and calm, had long avoided the truth of that night. Miss Marple, with her unassuming presence, coaxed it from him, not through pressure, but through gentle persistence. Over tea, with remarks about scripture, she drew him out, and at last, he admitted what he had kept locked away for years. Emily had come to him in confidence. She had been pregnant, but had not named the father. She had spoken of leaving, of peace, and of being called to the bell tower, by someone she trusted. And Miss Marple understood. Mr. Willoughby had kept that letter safe, but in doing so, had sealed away the very truth that needed to be heard. The bell tower, that silent sentinel, had called Emily, and someone in that quiet village had answered. As Miss Marple pondered the crucifix, the relics and the unanswered questions, she knew that some secrets are never truly hidden. They live in the spaces between words, in the dust behind portraits, and in the silences we choose to keep. And now those silences were beginning to speak louder than ever. The silver crucifix, unremarkable in design, yet unmistakable in its wear, held a quiet story etched into its edges. Its once polished surface now dulled, its inscription faded as though time itself had tried to bury its meaning. Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes, and even sharper understanding of human nature, noted its history, not as an object of faith, but as one of love and regret. The faint burn mark, the kind left by too close proximity to fire, was not the only trace of its past. She had seen it before, not in the hands of Mr. Willoughby, but around the neck of Emily Bowden, years ago, in the modest glow of the choir's practice room. She had worn it subtly, almost hiding it beneath her blouse, but there had been something in her eyes that spoke of an attachment beyond its religious value, something more personal, something to be cherished. As Miss Marple traced the outline of the crucifix, the pieces began to fall into place. It wasn't just that Emily had once held the trinket in her hands. She had entrusted it to someone who even then, was already filled with regret. It was Timothy Crane, who had once been its keeper, a man whose involvement in the past had been buried in the silence of his own guilt. This was no mere coincidence, Miss Marple realized. The exchange had not been accidental, nor had the return of the crucifix been a twist of fate. It was part of a reckoning, a reminder of forgotten love, of sins unspoken, and betrayals that time could never heal. The bells that had rung all those years ago, signaling the end of one life, had now begun to ring again, this time summoning the truths that had remained hidden in the shadows. The confrontation, when it came, was quiet but intense. No dramatic outburst, no public revelation, just a slow unraveling of the ties that bound people to their secrets. Delia Willoughby, her face calm, but her eyes filled with the weight of years spent in silence, confronted Timothy beneath the old elm tree, where he had taken to sitting. Her voice, soft but resolute, cut through the air with a single question. "Do you know what happened to Emily Bowden?" The words hung between them, a reminder of the past neither could escape. Timothy's response was fragmented, brittle. He denied any wrongdoing, of course, but his trembling hands betrayed him. He had left St. Chad's Hollow years ago, with no words of farewell to many, least of all Emily. Miss Marple, watching from afar, saw the guilt in his posture, not the theatrical kind, but the kind that spoke of private failure and fear. There was no need to hear the rest. The truth was already there, hanging in the air, woven through the spaces between their words. It was in the way Timothy could not look at the tower, in the way he avoided facing the past he had tried so desperately to leave behind. The truth had not come from pressure, but from presence. Miss Marple's quiet, patient persistence had drawn it from him. And yet there was more. The Reverend, a man of peace but not of courage, had known more than he let on. He had promised Emily he would keep her secret safe, but in doing so, he had allowed a far more dangerous silence to take root. When Miss Marple spoke with him, it was not with the intent to press him for details, but to listen, to simply be present. She had no need for the full story. She only needed to understand that the peace he sought had been built on a lie, one that had festered for years, threatening to unravel the fragile fabric of the village's delicate tranquility. And as the truth finally came to light, it was no longer about relics or regret. It was about justice, about the bells that should never have rung in isolation, about the silence that had allowed a tragedy to repeat itself. In the end, the reckoning had come, not with the clamor of an exposed scandal, but with the quiet recognition that some truths, when finally spoken, carry with them the weight of years lost to fear, to cowardice, and to the cruel repetition of history. The afternoon sunlight filtered in through the weathered windows of the village hall, casting long shadows over the faces of those gathered. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the calm in her demeanor, a stark contrast to the tension in the room. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken truths, each individual sitting in anxious silence, waiting for the inevitable unraveling of a mystery that had lurked beneath the surface for far too long. The group before her, Delia Willoughby, Reverend Marchmont, Lucian Gray, Timothy Crane, and Alice, had arrived under the pretense of a casual parish meeting, but all knew that the real reason they had been summoned was something far more ominous. The room was quiet, save for the occasional creak of old wood as the villagers shifted in their seats, unable to escape the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over them. With deliberate slowness, Miss Marple began to speak, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable authority that demanded attention. "I believe," she said, her words cutting through the stillness like a blade, "that there is a truth that has been hidden here, beneath the floorboards of this village, a truth that has haunted us for years." Her eyes swept over the faces of her audience, pausing briefly on Timothy Crane, whose expression had tightened at the mention of the past. A truth that was first signaled by the toll of the bell, 10 years ago, and then again just recently. A bell that I believe was not only a call to mourning, but a summons to the reckoning that was long overdue. The room held its breath, the gravity of her words sinking in like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of unease across the faces of the gathered. "You see," Miss Marple continued, her voice never wavering, "this bell, this simple mechanism, holds the key to understanding what happened to Emily Bowden. What was concealed beneath the layers of time and silence. And I believe," she paused, her gaze now fixed firmly on Timothy, "that you, Mr. Crane, hold the missing piece of that puzzle." There was no anger in her voice, no accusation, just a quiet understanding that seemed to make the room feel smaller, the walls closing in as the truth edged closer to the surface. "You returned to this village, not by chance, but to bury a memory that you could no longer escape. You were not seeking rest, nor retreat. What you sought was concealment, from others, and from yourself." Timothy Crane's face grew pale, his lips pressed into a thin line as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the weight of years of guilt pressing down on him. Lucian and Delia exchanged a quick, confused glance, their expressions a mixture of concern and disbelief. Miss Marple's gaze softened slightly as she spoke again, her voice gentle but unyielding. "You were not the father of Emily's child, Timothy," she said, each word punctuated by a long pause that seemed to stretch on forever, "but you were the one she waited for. And when you left her in silence, trusting that time would bury her memory as it had buried the truth." Timothy's eyes flickered, a flash of regret passing through them before he turned away, unable to meet her gaze. You knew the danger of what had been left behind, and yet you said nothing. Perhaps you feared what the truth would reveal about yourself, or perhaps what others might discover. The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the soft rustling of fabric as Delia clenched her hands in her lap, her face pale and drawn. But you returned, Miss Marple continued, her voice unwavering, and with your return came the return of the bell, a bell that rang not just for the loss of Emily Bowden, but for the loss of something else, a bell that I believe you knew would call to you. She turned to Reverend Marchmont, whose expression had grown somber, the weight of the past settling over him like a dark cloud, and it was in that moment, when the bell rang again, that Mr. Willoughby confronted you, not just as a man seeking answers, but as the man who had been holding on to a truth long buried, a truth that would have remained hidden if not for the ringing of that bell. As Miss Marple's words hung in the air, the tension in the room was palpable, thick with anticipation. Everyone knew that the truth had finally been laid bare. There was no turning back now. The village church, silent but for the faint rustle of the wind outside, had been witness to many secrets, but none so tightly held as the one Miss Marple now began to unravel. She sat in the center of the gathered few, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as the quiet hum of uncertainty settled around her. There had been no need for accusations, for Miss Marple knew that the truth, like a tide, would come to shore in its own time. With the same calm precision, she spoke. In this village, she began softly, there are things we have buried deep, buried so well that we have forgotten what it means to be honest with ourselves. She let her gaze drift across the room, catching the eyes of each person present, each of them trying to hold the weight of their secrets. The bell, she continued, had tolled twice now for two victims. One, a girl who vanished into the night, and the other, a man whose fall had been more deliberate than anyone wished to admit. The rope, she reminded them, had been retied after each death. The knot, not frayed but new, tighter. A deliberate act, not of accident, but of concealment. The Reverend Marchmont's brow furrowed in confusion, but Miss Marple could see that he was beginning to understand. She turned her attention to Timothy Crane, his shoulders stiff, his silence more telling than any words could be. "You returned to this village under a different name," she said, her voice unwavering. "Not for rest, not for retreat, but to escape what you had done. Emily trusted you, Mr. Crane. She trusted you with her heart. And when she disappeared, you said nothing. You feared what the truth would reveal, what you would be held responsible for." The air thickened with the weight of her words, and though no one spoke, they could all feel the truth pressing against them. Miss Marple was not accusing. She was simply illuminating what had been hidden in plain sight. It was not the father of Emily's child who had been silent, she continued, her voice soft but clear, but you, Mr. Crane, who had left her behind. And now you returned, not as the man she had once known, but as someone hiding from the past. She paused, letting the room absorb her words before turning her attention to Willoughby, who had confronted Timothy. The bell had rung twice, she said, but it had not been an accident. It was a call for help, a summons to face what had been hidden, but no help had come. The fall of Willoughby had not been an accident, she explained, but a struggle, a push, a desperate attempt to silence what could no longer be ignored. There was no drama, no wild accusations, only the steady pull of truth, laid bare for all to see. The trap door had been locked, but not by Willoughby, she stated, her gaze fixed firmly on Timothy. You returned, Mr. Crane, not as a bystander, but as someone who feared exposure. You tied the rope, locked the door, and created the illusion of safety. She allowed the words to settle, watching as each person in the room processed the weight of what had been said. And then, in the silence, she added, "There is still more to explain." Her voice was not harsh but certain, and her gaze turned to the next person. "Iris Fellows," she said, her words cold and measured. A woman who believed her secrets were hers to command, who had access to the church's records, and to its sacred garments, one of which, you may recall, was found torn near her body. The room tensed, the air thick with the scent of guilt and fear. Iris knew what she was doing, Miss Marple continued, her tone unwavering. She had seen the cracks in the facade, and she had used that knowledge to her advantage. But the truth always has a way of revealing itself, and now it is time for the village to face what it has tried to hide for far too long. In the stillness that followed, there was no sound but the slow exhale of breath, the unspoken understanding that at last, the bell had rung for the truth to be heard. As the room settled into a heavy silence, the air thick with unspoken truths, Miss Marple's gaze remained unwavering, her voice steady yet cutting through the stillness like a blade. "It wasn't just the bell," she began, the words dripping with precision. "It was the weight of a secret so fragile yet so deadly, one that had clung to this parish like an illness, infecting all it touched. Timothy Crane had thought he could bury it. Bury the guilt, the fear, the shame. But secrets, when left untouched, fester and grow. He'd convinced himself that time would soften the memory, that distance would make it fade. But in truth, all he had done was allow it to simmer in silence, waiting for the moment when it would resurface with a vengeance." The room hung on her every word as she carefully pieced together the puzzle, not just of Mr. Willoughby's tragic fall, but of a web of deceit and cowardice that had been spun long before. "Timothy's actions," she continued, her voice soft but cutting, "were not born of malice, but of fear of being found out, of facing the consequences of a truth he had tried so desperately to avoid. When he saw Mr. Willoughby, the bell ringing in the distance like a haunting reminder of his sins, he knew it was inevitable. The truth was going to surface, and so in his panic, he tried to silence it, just as he had tried to silence everything else." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in, then shifted her gaze to Mrs. Iris Fellows, whose face betrayed nothing yet seemed to speak volumes. "But Miss Fellows," Miss Marple said, her voice lowering with quiet authority. She was no stranger to secrets. She knew, perhaps not the full extent, but enough to see through Timothy's facade. She was a woman of observation, sharp in ways others failed to recognize. And so, when she discovered what had transpired in the tower, she did not confront Timothy with rage or accusation. No, her approach was subtle, her words coated in kindness, yet beneath them lay a promise, a threat perhaps, that if Timothy did not act, she would reveal everything. The tension in the room thickened as Miss Marple's words echoed, and she turned her attention back to the small sundial in the garden. It wasn't just a trinket, was it? That sundial, so seemingly insignificant, held a darker truth, the residue of a poison, so small, so easily overlooked, but deadly nonetheless. Cyanide. It had been taken from Mr. Willoughby's own workshop, mixed with care, a precise science born of desperation. The poison, transferred from the sundial to Mrs. Fellows' teacup, was not a mistake. It was a calculated act, an act of fear. Timothy, in his haste, had hoped to warn her, to silence her, but in the end, it was the silence that killed her. Miss Marple's voice softened, her eyes narrowing as she watched the faces around her. The poison, so easily concealed, did its work. And Timothy, she said, turning to him with a steady, unyielding gaze, you didn't mean to kill her, you didn't intend to take her life. But the truth, once set free, is a powerful force. It doesn't disappear. It always finds its way to the surface. There was no dramatic reveal, no shocking gasp, only the slow exhale of breath, the inevitable stillness that followed the confrontation of truth. Timothy Crane sat there, the weight of his guilt crushing him, his voice a broken whisper as he confessed, not with the grandiosity of a man who had been caught, but with the exhaustion of someone who had lived with the burden for far too long. "I thought I could leave it behind," he said, his voice cracking. "I thought if I stayed away, it would fade. But the bell, it never stopped ringing. It never stopped haunting me." His words were not filled with malice, nor were they drenched in remorse. They were simply the truth, a truth he had tried so desperately to deny. "And Iris," he whispered, his gaze shifting to the ground, "I didn't know what else to do. She cornered me. She knew too much." The confession was quiet, almost defeated, as though the years of hiding had finally caught up with him. And Miss Marple, ever so patient, allowed him his moment, her silence speaking volumes. In the end, there was no drama, no outburst, just the quiet understanding that in time, the truth had found its voice. The pieces of the puzzle were laid bare, not for shock or judgment, but for the simple acknowledgement that sometimes, the darkest secrets are the hardest to bury. And in the quiet aftermath, the bell continued to toll, not for the dead, but for the living, those who would carry the weight of the truth, long after the final confession had been made. The church bell rang unexpectedly, its deep mournful tone resonating through the stillness of the village, an unbidden herald that echoed not of death or catastrophe, but of endings, quiet and inevitable, like the drawing of a final breath. Miss Marple, seated calmly in her favorite chair, her knitting forgotten in her lap, looked up at the tower, with an expression of quiet understanding. There was something about bells, she mused to Alice later, that always rang for a reason, but never without permission. It was a thought that settled in her chest, carrying with it the weight of all that had transpired, and all that had yet to come. When the formalities arrived, they did so without fanfare. Superintendent Hale, a man whose demeanor was as measured as his silence, took Timothy Crane into custody with no more than a word. No struggle, no show of authority. The villagers watched, muted, their gaze flickering between the man who had once been one of them, and the consequences that now clung to him like a shroud. There were no cries for justice, no tears, only a slow acceptance of what was both inevitable and long overdue. In the shadows, Reverend Marchmont offered a private prayer, not for forgiveness, but for the softening of hearts, an unspoken plea for the mercy that none of them truly understood. Then, in a quiet voice, Delia, standing apart from the rest, murmured a prayer of her own, a prayer not for judgment but for remembrance, for the soul of the one who had, in the end, only succumbed to the weight of his own guilt. Miss Marple, ever the observer, knew that justice didn't always repair what had been broken. Sometimes it simply allowed what remained to settle into its rightful place, a quiet vigil for the things lost and found. Time, as it always did, moved on. The parish resumed its rhythms. Mrs. Simpkins was back to teaching piano. The altar boys laughed near the tower once again, and even Lucy and Gray, who had lingered too long, found their way to a silent departure, leaving behind only a letter of gratitude and the softest of farewells. Life, like the crocuses and lilacs in the garden outside, had begun to bloom again, though the shadows of the past still lingered just beneath the surface, waiting. The bell tower, now sealed, stood as a monument to all that had occurred, not broken but listening, its silence a solemn reminder of the past, holding the village in its quiet embrace. And though time had not stopped, it had paused, like a deep breath before the next chapter unfolded. Miss Marple sat by the window, watching the seasons shift outside, her knitting idle in her hands, her thoughts drifting between the rhythm of nature and the unspoken seasons that people passed through, those of regret, repair, and quiet reflection. Even the garden at the vicarage seemed to acknowledge these cycles, its blooms opening with a suddenness that seemed to echo the rhythms of the human heart. Life had moved on, but in the corners of the village, where the bell once rang, there was still a silence that held the past gently in its grip, waiting for the future to unfold. The vicar, more often than not, had taken to pruning the roses himself, as though seeking solace in the quiet, repetitive task, while Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, had resumed her lacework, though her fingers moved slower than usual, as though something deeper had stilled her. There were no celebrations, no outward signs of renewal, only the gentle unfolding of life, like the first green sprig that pokes through the cold, stubborn earth after a long, harsh winter. Life didn't announce its return, it simply made itself known, and beneath that soft reawakening, Miss Marple pondered the nature of the past, not as something to escape, but as something to step through with care, with reflection, to truly understand what came next. As the kettle hummed its steady tune in the next room, Miss Marple, with her knitting resting idly in her lap, found herself lost in thought, not about the crime itself, but the silences that had framed it. The quiet, unspoken things that had been allowed to settle like dust. "I've always thought," she murmured softly to Alice, "that guilt is never as neat as we pretend. It frays at the edges, slips through the cracks of our best intentions." It had shown itself in Timothy Crane's shaking hands, in Mrs. Fellowes' uncharacteristic industriousness, in Reverend Marchmont's careful avoidance of certain truths, and it had lingered in the long, painful silence surrounding Emily Bowden's name, a silence not born of malice, but discomfort, a collective smothering of truth beneath layers of politeness and ritual. The village had not denied her memory. No, they had simply buried it, wrapped in a shroud of unspoken understanding. "Guilt," Miss Marple continued with a distant gaze, "is not always held by the wicked. Sometimes it belongs to those who meant no harm, the ones who looked away, who kept quiet to protect someone or something. In doing so, they allowed harm to settle, to grow like mildew in a forgotten corner." Her knitting slipped between her fingers as she adjusted a drop stitch, her mind still swirling with the weight of it all. It was not the murder itself that had marked St. Chad's Hollow. It was the slow, insidious accumulation of silence, the moments when someone could have spoken, should have spoken, but didn't. The bell, that old creaking bell, had tolled twice, not to mark death, but to summon the truth. Once for a girl who had vanished into the shadows of the village, and once for a man who had lived beneath a veil of guilt for far too long. Both times, the village had failed to listen in time. The silver crucifix, once burned and tarnished, was returned at last, not to the vestry or the archives, but to Emily Bowden's grave. There was no grand ceremony, only a quiet, reverent moment between those who had understood the weight of it all. Alice had placed it there with a small nod, while Lucian stood at a distance, his head bowed in respectful silence, his hands clasped tightly behind him. Miss Marple, however, did not linger. She had never believed in grand gestures for the departed, only in quiet remembrance. The crucifix lay gently atop the moss-covered stone, not as a symbol of mourning, but as a symbol of memory, a final gesture of peace given not by the parish, but by the truth itself. As the twilight stretched across the vicarage lawn, Miss Marple sat by the window once again, her knitting in her lap, the faintest hum of the evening air stirring the lace curtains. She did not speak of the case, nor of the confession, nor of Emily, for the words had already been spoken in the quiet, unremarkable moments that had followed. Instead, as the kettle began to sing its gentle song, Miss Marple looked at Alice, and said softly, almost as if to herself, "It is not the bell itself, you know, but why it rings that reveals the truth." With that she resumed her knitting, stitch by stitch, thought by thought, as the village at last settled into its uneasy peace, the quiet aftermath of a story long buried, finally allowed to breathe, into the soft embrace of a spring that had waited patiently, almost wistfully, for its moment to bloom. The quiet lanes of St. Chad's Hollow seemed to sigh in the stillness, where secrets clung to the earth like the lingering scent of winter's frost. The bell, that old creaking relic of the village, tolled not for ceremony, but for something far more powerful, a reckoning. Miss Marple, with her unparalleled ability to see beyond the surface, reminded us all that tragedy often arises, not from the darkest of hearts, but from the shadows of unspoken truths, the fear of confronting the past. Timothy Crane, though not a man driven by malice, had been crushed beneath the weight of a silence too heavy to bear. His actions, born not out of hatred, but of guilt and fear, had set in motion a series of events far darker than he could have imagined. It was not justice that stung, but necessity, the harsh necessity of truth. And perhaps that is where the heart of this tale lies, within the quiet corners of small villages, in lives lived beneath the weight of hidden sorrows. The greatest wrongs are rarely born from the things people do, but from the things they choose not to say, from the silences that grow like weeds in the heart. And so, the question lingers, unanswered. If you had been in Timothy's shoes, haunted by the echo of a name you dare not speak, cornered by a truth long buried, what would you have done? Would you have spoken sooner, or would you too have waited in silence, until that same bell tolled once again, this time, not for a lost soul, but for the truth. The bell, after all, always finds its moment to ring, its moment to reveal what we have been hiding from ourselves. What moved you most in this story? Did the truth surprise you? Or did you, like Miss Marple, see it coming from the very beginning? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. We're always listening. Your reflections help bring others closer to the heart of these mysteries. And if this story intrigued you, consider subscribing for more tales woven with subtle clues, sharp observation, and the lingering suspense of what's left unsaid. Share this story with someone who loves the thrill of untold truths, for stories like this are best enjoyed when shared. Until next time, remember the truth, like the bell, will always find its moment to ring.